Continuing with our topic of aquatic life zones, we're still focusing on the freshwater types of aquatic life zones, and I'd like to spend some time discussing inland wetlands. Inland wetlands form away from the coast, and they are called marshes, swamps, and possibly prairie potholes. Some are filled with water year-round, and others are only underwater for a short time each year. Freshwater inland wetlands are sponges that provide ecosystem and economic services. And I refer to sponges, that means that they absorb water when it rains and help control flooding. So some examples of the different ecological and economic services that they provide are they filter and degrade waste and water pollution. So to me, they act like nature's kidneys. They limit flooding and erosion. They sustain stream flow during droughts. They help recharge groundwater aquifers. They definitely maintain biodiversity and are known as a hot spot for biodiversity. And they provide recreation for people. The definition on the screen in front of you is the official Pennsylvania state definition for a wetland. I'd like you to draw your attention to a few key words in this definition. The definition reads as those areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and that under normal circumstances does support, a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. Let's look at a few key terms here. Saturated by surface or groundwater. That means there needs to be water present. We also call this hydrology. Vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. Vegetation that grows in wet soils is often called hydrophytic vegetation. And then saturated soil conditions, we often refer to these as hydric soils. So there's a couple different names for wetlands that are depicted on this screen, including wet meadows and bogs and mud flats. And like I mentioned earlier, wetlands can be covered by water all or part of the time of year, and the inland wetland must be located away from a coastal area. They also exclude lakes, reservoirs, and streams. And the three giveaways that a wetland could be present are the wetland plants, the wetland soils, and the water content in the particular area. Common wetland plants that we typically think of are cattails, bulrushes, and sycamore trees, as well as like wetland grasses and water lilies. Each year, about 183 miles of inland wetlands in the U.S. are lost. Most of this loss, about 80%, is caused by agriculture. The remaining is due to mining, forestry, highways, and urban development. We have different laws that regulate what can be done in regards to a wetland, and one thing that's written into our law is something called mitigation. If someone wants to fill a wetland in order to build a building, that person would need to request a state permit and a federal permit allowing the approval to fill in the wetlands. In order to do that, the person filling in the wetlands may be required to do what's called mitigation, where they are allowed to fill in a section of wetlands as long as they create, build, design, and construct an equal or greater area of the same type of wetland somewhere else nearby. It doesn't even have to be on the same property, as long as it's within a certain mile radius of the wetland that's being filled in. So, functions of wetlands are listed on the screen in front of you, and these have already been mentioned before. The ecological importance of wetlands is that it's a great place for food of different waterfowl, as well as habitat for fish. Many waterfowl migrate through the wetlands, and there's just a great species diversity of plants and animals. Living in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and teaching at Hack College, we have some wetlands nearby that I'm going to show you on a map later on. These wetlands are a major stopping point for the white egret, which was pictured in the previous slide, and in Pennsylvania the white egret is considered to be an endangered species. So, wetlands can be really important in terms of species diversity and providing good habitat for species that are threatened or endangered. As I mentioned earlier, wetlands, I consider them as nature's kidneys because they improve water quality by filtering waste as well. And then they help reduce flooding and they control erosion too. So the three key things that we look for when we're defining whether or not a wetland is present in a particular area are hydrophytic vegetation, hydric soils, and hydrology. And each of those are defined on the screen in front of you. Hydrophytic species are basically plants that morphologically or physiologically adapt in order to grow in wet environments as well as soil conditions that are oxygen deficient. The soils we call hydric soils typically have very little oxygen because the water table will flood the soils and as a result push the oxygen out of the pore space between the soils. Hydric soils tend to have a varied colored appearance of orange and tan and black and red. They're not uniform in color as a typical upland soil is. And sometimes they can have a high amount of organic material known as peat. And basically it consists of a lot of wetland grasses and leaves and plant debris that has fallen into the water or on top of the soil due to seasonal, winter times, and that material is breaking down and decaying. As that material breaks down and decays, you typically can have a rotten egg odor that smells, that's because of the sulfur, that's hydrogen sulfide that's being given off during the decay process. And then finally, if there's any sign of a shallow groundwater table or surface water ponding in the area, that's called hydrology. If that's present, then that's a giveaway that we have a wetland. So here are some different plants that we typically find in wetlands. And even though the pictures may not depict that it looks like a wetland area, the plants can definitely thrive in saturated soil conditions as well as water ponding conditions. So the box elder is one. The red maple, the silver maple, the water plantain, this is definitely an easy giveaway plant that there's wetlands. The alligator weed obviously loves to grow in water-prone areas. The green ash, the lotus, and by the way, the American lotus in Pennsylvania looks very much like this. It's like a water lily, and it's considered a threatened plant species in Pennsylvania. The sycamore tree, the pin oak, the arrowhead arum definitely likes to grow in water ponded areas but can still grow in saturated hydric soil conditions. And there's many, many more plants that also are conducive to growing in wetlands, but I wanted to give you a few key ones to highlight some of them. So when we classify wetlands, not only do we look at the hydrology, the hydrophytic vegetation, and the hydric soils, but we break them into systems. They are marine, which represents ocean-type habitat, estuarine, which represents coastal areas of wetlands where there's freshwater and saltwater mixing together. There's riverine, where there are wetlands directly adjacent to stream channels or rivers. Lacustrine systems are where wetlands are adjacent to lakes, ponds, and reservoirs. And palustrine. These are areas that do not include lakes, ponds, reservoirs, or coastal areas, but rather they're just in a general, generic inland landscape, and because of a shallow water table, there's a wetland there. The wetland classes are based on the type of vegetation that are present, and we typically have three classes: emergent, scrub shrub, and forested. And I'm going to show you some pictures of those. In the top left corner, we have an emergent wetland, and these are characterized by short, stubby grasses, not necessarily stubby, but short grasses that cover the entire area, as well as like the arrowhead arum and different types of water lilies. So that's an emergent wetland. This picture on the bottom left is labeled as a riparian wetland, but this is a stream flowing through here, and the proper classification of this would actually be a riverine wetland. And this area here, because of the shortness of the vegetation, would be qualified as an emergent wetland. On the right, I have a picture of a forested wetland. And a forested wetland is one in which the landscape is dominated by wetland conducive trees that are greater than 20 feet in height. And you can see there's quite a few trees here that are typically growing in saturated wet soil conditions. Also, the understory predominance of ferns gives it away that this is a wetland, forested wetland. This top left corner is a scrub-shrub wetland, and it's characterized by, moderately high shrubby vegetation. You can have some sparse trees in the area, but it's mainly comprised of bushes and shrubs like the swamp rose mallow and the bulrush shrub. And this picture down in the bottom right corner is considered to be a forested wetland, and even though the trees themselves may not be fully conducive to forested wetland trees, the giveaway is this skunk cabbage that's present here, because skunk cabbage is common in wetlands. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to talk about is that there are seasonal variations that can impact how the hydrology is displayed. So here on the left we have a seasonal wetland that has ponded water during the spring season, and on the right, notice that during the summer it's probably going to be more dry and that water is gone. But there are sediment covered leaves, and you can tell that the soil is darker color here in the back, indicating that it's been wet in the past. Now I'd like to show you a website that can be used to actually map out whether or not there are any wetlands in a given particular area in the United States. This website is known as the Wetland Mapper website. It is maintained by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it maps any wetlands that have been qualified to meet the requirements of the National Wetland Inventory. So these are federally recognized wetlands that are being mapped via this website. So I'm going to click on the link, and it's going to take me to the Fish and Wildlife Service website with the Wetland Data Mapper, and I'm going to click on the tool, and a map of the United States is going to come up that I'm going to quickly just zoom in to find Harrisburg, Pennsylvania over here by the Susquehanna River. And I'm actually zooming in to where the Harrisburg HAC Community College campus is located. This is where HAC is located. Alright, so this tool's pretty cool because I can click on these color shaded areas and it'll tell me that this is a freshwater forested shrub wetland, and the P here in this wetland classification code stands for palustrin, and the FO stands for forested. It even tells me the number of acres that fall into this classification, and there's 26 acres. Now I'm going to click on the lighter green color, and again we're coming up with a freshwater emergent wetland of about 24 acres. The P stands for palustrin, and now the EM stands for emergent. You can use this website in many different ways, especially if you're going into the field of environmental science, but even on a personal note, if you're purchasing a piece of property and you want to make sure, you want to determine if there's any wetlands nearby, you can simply use this as a tool to research. This is a map depicting wetland losses between the 1780s and 1980s. Over 22 states have lost at least 50% of their original wetlands. 7 states have lost over 80% of their original wetlands, and they include Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky, Iowa, California, and Ohio. Since the 1970s, the most extensive losses of wetlands have been in the Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Florida, South Carolina, and North Carolina area. Pennsylvania is categorized in the 40 to 60% loss of wetlands. This is a list of how human activities are disrupting and degrading freshwater systems. Putting in canals can be detrimental, as well as flood control levees. And then obviously agriculture and urban pollution is one of the major ways in which we're impacting our water quality, and draining wetlands as well. This concludes our presentation pertaining to freshwater aquatic life zones.